Okay, welcome back. We're going to continue talking about plant classification. Anyways, the terms we're covering today are going to get more interesting, and you're going to be using them a lot throughout this term. So make sure you get familiar with them. If you have any questions, I'm sure that Linda and Paul are more than happy to clarify during your labs. Send me an email if you need anytime. So we talked about last week about kingdom, division, class, order, family, genus, species. Go down through all the different classifications, and we're focusing on genus species here in this course. And the idea of genus species being what we call a binomial name, that just means there's two names, genus being the first, species being the last. Typically what we do is we group things based on similarities into a genus. So everything that has a specific trait, that they all share that same trait, are moved into a specific genus. And then to distinguish between the individuals within that genus, we separate them by differences. So we gather them first by their similarities into a genus, and then we divide them with the species into subcategories or individual species within that genus. I hope that makes sense. Got a few examples comparing a human to an apple. Humans are in kingdom Animalia, apples in Plantae. Humans are in division Chordata, apples in Magnoliopta. Humans are in the class Mammalia, and apples in Magnoliopsida. Humans are in the primates category, where apples are in the Rosales. And humans are in the family of Hominidae, and apples are in Rosaceae. And then, of course, the two we're most interested in this course, the genus and species, humans are Homo sapien and apples are Malus domestica. Some other breakdown here. The Plantae means plant, that kingdom. Division of Magnoliopta means it's a flowering plant. The class Magnoliopsida means it's a dicot. We'll talk about that later today. Rosalis means it's in the rose order, and it's in the rose family. So apples are related to roses. And if you look at roses this time of the year, you'll see they have like a little apple on them. It's called a rose hip. Those are edible, kind of mealy. I used to make jam as a family every year with them. It was all right. It was kind of not my favorite, but hey, maybe one of you really loves it. Looking at a different plant, the white pine, we know it's a plant, so it's in the Plantae kingdom, but it is not in the same division as apples. It's in the Gymnosperms division. And it's also in a Pinaceae, so it's a conifer, and it's in the order of Pinales, which is in the pine order, which is then in the pine family. And of course, Pinus strobus, as I alluded to last week, the genus being Pinus and the species being strobus. Coconut, flowering monocot, Magnoliopta, Liliopsida, and it's the Caucus nucifera. Anyways, so based on that, we don't just classify things based on genus species. We look at other aspects of how the plant grows. So we're going to look at that a little more today. The stem growth, the nature of their life cycle, the types of tissues that the plants produce, and looking at things like leaves. So again, another example, going back to that apple tree, it is a perennial, it's deciduous, it has wood, it's what we call a higher vascular plant, it's also a flowering plant. So we're going to look deeper into all this, but just before I get into that, I want to just a little of interest slightly, whoop, there goes the clock, because technically before we even get into those types of plants, there are evolutionary more primitive species. And to divide the plant kingdom, to acknowledge the more primitive plant species, we have to first divide them into what we call vascular and non-vascular. So non-vascular plants are plants that don't have veins in their tissues to move fluids around. So in our bodies, we have arteries and we have veins, and they move fluid all over the place, as we know well. Non-vascular plants are ancient plants that live in moist areas. They have to live in moist areas because All the tissues need to be in close proximity to moisture, otherwise they will dry out because there's no way to move water from one part of the plant to another. In the picture is a really common non-vascular plant that we see in greenhouses and nurseries and in wet places in your garden too. It's called the liverwort, and they are fascinating ancient plants, fossils. Um, they reproduce asexually and sexually, so they have fruiting bodies. These little palm tree things that you see here are fruiting bodies. They're called sporangium, and they produce structures that will help the plant produce. These do not have true roots or leaves. They do not have vascular tissue, remember? So they have what looks like roots, but they're really just cells that are extended deep into the soil by, well, deep, maybe a few millimeters. And so they move water just through absorption. It just moves passively, wicking through the cell tissues. And of course, because they don't have tissues, that limits their ability to grow. So they're always going to be sort of a thin mat. They never form a very large structure because the ability for water to move through the tissues is just too restricted. In the picture, there's a plant that has, the surface of the soil looks green because it's covered by liverworts. Sometimes they're viewed as a nuisance. I don't know. It's kind of whatever. It depends on you. Obviously, beyond non-vascular, we have vascular plants. In the picture, there we have veins. We've all seen veins in a leaf. Those veins continue through to the stem and right down through to the root so that the plants can move not only water, but sugars and other minerals back and forth as they are needed. And of course, once plants developed a vasculature, they are able to increase their size. And unlike the liverwort, which was confined to a thin layer in the soil, here we have an example of a tree that's grown very tall. And that is simply afforded by the very fact that that plant has veins or vasculature that moves fluids. These vascular cells are what we call conducting vessels. We're going to get into the anatomy of that later in the course, but they pass through all the tissues. Now, continuing with dividing plants into categories, so we have our vascular and non-vascular. We also have, within vascular, we have lower and higher, which is kind of confusing because it has nothing to do with the height of the plant. It has more to do with its evolutionary age. Lower plants are considered more ancient. And it's kind of ironic, like the lower plants that we still have around the world are 470 million years ago is when they first started appearing on the planet. And higher plants appeared 420 million years ago. And you might be like, wow, that's really not that far, but still it's 50 million years, right? That's a long time. So higher plants are, I don't want to say more sophisticated, but they have evolved into more complex systems to some extent over the lower vascular plants. So looking at lower vascular plants, they have vascular tissues, but they have two types of reproduction, right? So with the lower and higher, they have different strategies. Looking at lower, in this picture, you can see already where I'm going. We have ferns, for example. Ferns are ancient lower plants, and we see them down in the bottom of coal mines and whatnot as they're sort of fossilized in the coal. And they, to this day, still exist, and they reproduce by these older systems, which employ spores. Underneath the leaves, they form mounds, sometimes referred to as sporangia or sori even, if it's in a dedicated structure. Release spores, where higher vascular plants reproduce by flowers and seeds. All right, so we've got non-vascular, we've got vascular, and in the vascular, we've got lower and we've got higher. The lower ones reproduce with spores, the higher ones reproduce with seeds. Interestingly, the lower vascular process of reproduction does employ spores, and typically those evolve into plantlets which produce eggs and sperms. On the bottom right corner of this slide is a hairy structure. The sperms in lower vascular plants are that type of group, the division, are typically multiflagellate, and they will seek out the female part, fertilize it. It's quite a complicated structure. These pictures all have links. If you go to your original PowerPoint file, you can click on the links and learn more about how these work. But essentially for this lesson, because I've got a lot of slides to go through and I'm going to push through here, the lower vascular plants reproduce by spores and higher vascular plants reproduce by seeds. Interestingly, before I ask this question, if you're trying to reproduce spores or reproduce ferns, and you have ferns that have sort of these sporangia forming, if you can't shake the spores off the bottom of the fern, you can take the frond or the leaf, if you want to call it, and put it into a Ziploc bag with just a tiny bit of detergent and shake it up, and then take that water out and put it into a misting bottle and mist it onto a peat moss, a thin layer of peat moss in a tray. Ideally, that peat moss would have been sterilized with boiling water or something so you don't get other things or bacteria growing. Once you've sprayed it onto the surface of the peat moss, you would then put the entire tray into a plastic bag and seal it and put it in a warm place, and be very patient. It can take months for these things to germinate, and a lot of patience to form a new fern. Anyways, here's a question. An example of a non-vascular plant is A, a liverwort, B, bratwurst, C, a fern. An example of a non-vascular plant. So A, liverwort. The fruiting bodies of the liverwort are or is a sac, a sporangium, or a flower. So remember, liverwort is a non-vascular plant. It does not reproduce with flowers. It uses sporangium. A fern is a non-vascular, lower vascular, upper vascular. Well, ferns are much bigger than a small layer, so they do have vasculature, but they reproduce by spores, not by seeds, so they are lower vascular. And just reviewing from last week, a variety is A, naturally occurring, and B, human-made. And of course, the correct answer is naturally occurring. Remember, varieties occur naturally. If you seed them, they breed fairly true to type, where human-made cultivars need to be maintained by us. Otherwise, they revert or don't breed true to type. Moving forward into organizing plants, we have, as I've discussed so far, vascular and non-vascular. And in the vascular world, we have higher and lower. And then in the further dividing it, we have both gymnosperms and angiosperms. Okay, so let's look a little bit at that. That's cone-bearing versus bearing. Gymnosperms produce cones, so your conifers, right? And angiosperms produce flowers. Cone-bearing producing plants typically produce what's called a naked seed. Now, you've probably all seen a squirrel gnawing away at the cone. They're not eating the woody part of the cone, they're eating the seeds. Those seeds, when they say they're naked, it means they're not surrounded by an ovary. There's not a lot of fleshy material around there. A really good example of an ovary around seeds would be an apple, right? So when you bite an apple, the flesh that you're eating is the ovary, and the seeds are in the center, in the core. So conifers produce a naked seed, so there's not much to it, not much to sustain it. Angiosperms, which include all the flowering plants and a vast majority or a good chunk of the plant kingdom, they produce, they have different types of pollination. Their seeds are enclosed by an ovary, unlike the gymnosperms we just talked about. And the angiosperms, the flowering plants, are divided into two groups. Now in this slide, just out of curiosity, the top is bleeding heart, the bottom is a kind of, is it an iris or is it an orchid? I don't know. To be honest, I think it's an orchid, but anyway. The angiosperms are divided into two groups, right? So again, we're organizing plants, we're categorizing them. And the angiosperms are broken up into two monocots and dicots, so two groups. The monocots, which the fancy term for that is Liliopsida, and for dicots, the fancy term is Magnoliopsida. To help you remember, monocots, lilies are, as you go through the lessons, you'll see they're an easy example of monocots. The name lily is a monocot. It might help you remember that Liliopsida is another term for monocot. We'll come back to that as we go through the term for sure. Another way to distinguish monocots and dicots is looking at the veins in the leaves. So in a monocot, the leaves tend to be longer and the veins all run parallel through the tissue. And in dicots, the veins branch out like rivers and tributaries on a map. And so we call that netted venation. So we have angiosperms being divided into monocots and dicots, where we have parallel veins in monocots and netted veins in dicots. Looking at the flowers, monocots, the petals come in threes. And the dicots, the petals come in fours or fives. So it's not exactly as simple as, oh, they're just in fours or fives. So parallel veins and petals in three means it's a monocot. Netted veins and petals in fours or fives means monocot. Looking at the stems, there are more differences between monocots and dicots. Here on the left we have bamboo, which is a consistent thickness from top to bottom. They do get thicker as they grow, but they are the same thickness, basically top to bottom. Where dicots tend to be wider at the base and then narrow. More specifically, I would prefer to talk about bark. And monocots typically do not produce bark, where dicots typically do. And that's where we get this widening from, especially near the base. Looking at the seeds, and this is probably the simplest way to distinguish them. Monocots, then the term monocot, the cot is a truncation for the term cotyledon. And again, we'll look at a little bit more as we go through the term, but the cotyledon in a corn kernel is what pops to form your popcorn. Or it's let me get my pen going here. It's this structure that you see, and it's full of starch. And that's an energy reserve, starches and oils, and that fuels the growth of the new plant when it germinates, the root and the shoot. And in a dicot, this peanut, which I don't know if you can see how there's a crack. Next time you open a peanut, take a look. I'm sure you've all seen it. There's two halves. And if you split them, you end up with two halves, two sections, dicotyledon, dicot. Okay, so monocots have one cotyledon, dicots have two cotyledons. So separating angiosperms, we have the veins, we have the petals, we have bark, we have the seed structure. Lots more differences, and as we go into the term, we're going to look under microscopes and see some of the other tissue differences, maybe even the structures. So some questions for you. Corn is a monocot, a dicot, an angiosperm, A and B, or A and C, or B and C. So let's go through this. Corn has one cotyledon. That's the easiest way to remember. So it's a monocot. But corn flowers, so it's also an angiosperm. So it's A and C. Peanuts, they split into two, so they are a dicot. But peanuts also flower, so they're an angiosperm because they have a seed, right? We're talking about seeds. So it's B and C. So the answer E is correct. Pine trees, are they a monocot? Are they a dicot? Are they an angiosperm? No, they're a gymnosperm. They have a totally different seed structure. So again, organizing plants besides kingdom and genus and species and all that, we have vascular and non-vascular, higher and lower, gymnosperm, angiosperm. We've looked at stems. Now let's look at how stems grow, like just physically. So some plants grow upright. We call that erect or upright growth. Some are decumbent or inclined growth. So here we have a juniper that's spreading horizontally. Sometimes they're creeping, right? So they creep along the stem and reproduce wherever they touch the ground. Strawberries are a good example of that. Sometimes they grow as a vine and they need a structure to support them. So they're vining. These are broader terms that we help to distinguish between species as we're deciding what varieties or what is what and what's part of what family and what is part of what genus or not, that kind of thing. This picture is a climbing vine that, does anyone know what this is? Wisteria. It's beautiful when it flowers, if you have the right conditions, but beware, these things will grow, and if you put them on a trellis, they will lift it up and tear it and throw it out of the ground and throw it into your backyard. They are like the little shop of horrors. Be careful with wisteria. Keep it away from your house. So looking at stem growth, you can also look at the life cycle. How does that distinguish between? Well, we know there's annuals and there are perennials. So what is an annual? An annual is a plant that produces vegetative growth, and it produces all its growth in one growing season. Okay, so it has 1 year to germinate, grow, produce seeds, and then die. So that's an annual. Does anyone know what this picture is showing? So this is a picture of someone's lawn, and there's obviously, normal grass growing around it, normal being whatever grass you seem to like in your subdivision. And then there's this grass coming out of it. Anyone know? Crabgrass. Crabgrass is an annual. And the grass that grows in your lawn, does it die every year and then come back in the spring brown and have to reseed it? No, you seed it, it grows, and it comes back every year. So grass is a perennial, but crabgrass is an annual. And that's a helpful thing for you to know if you're trying to control crabgrass. Because if you clean it up 1 year before it sets seed, it won't come back. It's done, it's gone. But if you let it grow and set seed, you're going to have crabgrass again next year. So just keep that in mind. Before we get to perennial, there are, in between annual and perennial, there is biennial. Biennial plants, like foxglove or hollyhock, they produce their full life cycle over 2 years. So the first year is vegetative, and the second year is reproductive. Good to know if you're buying young plants like this at a garden center, because you might not get flowers the first year, and sometimes they don't tell you that. So you got to wait for a second year. Don't rip it out. Give it some time. Perennials obviously produce vegetative growth and then flower. And typically, the vegetative growth is in the first year, and then they start to flower in the second year. Typically, I say that because there are some sort of perennial weeds that are so aggressive they can have a more aggressive life cycle. But they tend to bloom second year, and obviously they continue to bloom thereafter until something happens or the plant dies or the climate is no longer suitable. So we can organize plants on their life cycle. So stem growth, life cycle, whether they form wood or don't. And with wood, we have two ways of plants can produce tissues as they age. Before we get to wood, let's look at herbaceous plants. Herbaceous plants, like for example, an onion, it's not an annual, it's a perennial in the sense that it grows, and what you see above the ground is only green tissues. There's no permanent structure there. It dies back in the winter, but it stores energy in the onion and produces new growth the next year for another year of onion growth. So they're forming structures. We'll talk more about as I go through the course, things like roots and tubers that form below the surface and allow the plant to survive to another generation. So that's what we call, when we're talking about the nature or age of tissues in the plants. So we have herbaceous plants and we have woody plants. So herbaceous plants do not produce woody tissues. Another example of a herbaceous perennial would be, this is a bearded iris that you're looking at here. And here's a rhizome underground that you would plant. And here's the 1 year's herbaceous growth. And of course, they produce a beautiful flower every year. So the type of tissues that form help us to further distinguish between the different plants. So herbaceous perennials do not produce wood. Woody plants obviously do. Trees being the easiest example, shrubs, there's other woody vines even. But wood allows plants to form immense structures. It supports just structurally a large plant, so they tend to be much, much bigger or capable of much larger growth. and it gives them some hardiness that allows them to live for a very long time. If you saw the picture of the person sitting at the base of this sequoia tree, um, you know, these trees can get very, very big. Even cars can drive through. I don't know if any of you have ever had the chance to travel to Yosemite in the United States, where they have beautiful sequoias and whatnot. If you ever have a chance, I highly recommend it. Wood is also very robust. You know, it allows plants to stand up to a lot of abuse. And this resourceful individual has found a way to get home from their camping trip minus a fourth wheel using wood. Um, Interestingly, the oldest known plant in Canada grows not far from Niagara on the escarpment, and that is these sort of gnarly little woody trees that have been growing in these outcroppings for thousands of years. A researcher had drilled a core through one of them and was counting the rings under a microscope and discovered that these things are ancient trees. And they grow very, very slowly, and the wood has preserved them and given them the chance to withstand the extreme climates. So further to whether a plant is herbaceous or woody, we also look at the leaves that they grow and whether the leaves fall off the plants or do not. And of course, we're talking about trees here, primarily where we talk about, or shrubs, where we talk about deciduous or evergreen. So deciduous trees where they shed their leaves and evergreens where they typically do not. So looking at all the different seasons and whether the leaves fall off or in your conifers they do not. So it's just another example of how we can categorize plants. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. I have no idea why there's a picture of a bear there, but I think I just thought it was a fun picture. And I have a photo of a bear, so just now let that out there. So let's look at an interesting one here, ginkgos. Which of the following statements classifies a ginkgo? I don't know if you've ever heard of a ginkgo tree. The ginkgo has leaves that are fan-shaped. I probably should have put a picture. There's one coming up. But it's an interesting tree. I've already given it away that it's a tree. So it's woody, which means it's a perennial woody tree. Does it flower? Kind of not. Does it have seeds? Kind of not. At the end of the day, what I'm getting at here is that ginkgo doesn't fit into any of these categories. Worth looking up the life cycle. If you go to the PowerPoint slide, click on the link. Takes you to a really good article that describes what ginkgos are. They're known as a living fossil. They would have gone extinct if it wasn't for some monks in China that kept them over the last few thousand years. They are very, very tough, which is sort of confusing as to why they didn't continue to survive in nature. Don't know if anyone has a definitive answer to that. But they reproduce with seeds, but they also have a fertilization stage that employs sperm and eggs. So they bridge the gap between the non-vascular and the lower vascular plant species and the flowering higher vascular and woody tissue type plants. So they are really fascinating plants to look at. I hope you found this interesting. I've kind of gone through it quickly. I just didn't want to burn through a lot of your time. You're going to cover again this in the lab with Linda and Paul, and we'll see you next time. Take care.